Good afternoon, everyone. Nice having you here today with us. Uh, it's one of our great sessions that have been coming, and today we're going to be a different one. We have an amazing speaker with us. He has experience, he has the work to show for it, he has a lot of evidence. In today's session, we are going to be discussing how to open source. We have been hearing a lot of about open source. Today, we will know more about it that you can even take a tutorial on it with your friends. So, Google Developer Students Club is organizing this session, how to open source an extensive guide for new contributors and maintainers. And the amazing speaker is going to be one and only Confidence Obenon. Okunbolom, pardon me for the mispronunciation. He's a software developer and advocate at AppSmith. Let me tell you a little bit about Confidence.
Yeah.
Confidence has been a developer for the almost 5 years now. He has he has worked with various development positions, software positions. He has worked as a front engineer, a full stack engineer, an admin, is the developer advocate at AppSmith. AppSmith, you might want be wondering what is the AppSmith? AppSmith is the platform that develop open source framework to build internal tools at different software organizations. Very to welcome Confidence Okobono.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Hamid. All right, it's exciting to be here and to share this session with you all on open source. Okay, so I think we can get started. So my screen should be up, and what we're going to be
Yes,
doing,
please.
yeah, what we're going to be doing today is having a conversation around um, how to create better open source communities, both for maintainers and open source contributors. Because if you've ever contributed to open source, you realize that it can be especially challenging if you are a maintainer. So, how can you work with contributors, and how can contributors work with you to create a thriving open source community? So, that is what we're going to discuss in today's session, how to open source. So it's going to be a guide for both contributors and open source maintainers. A little bit about me. So Hamid already gave some introduction about who I am, but to add a little bit of context to it, I am a software engineer and a developer advocate. And what that means is that I get to build a lot of exciting projects, and it's also my job to share those projects along with my learnings in the journey with you all. So that's what I do in a nutshell. And I have a YouTube channel I create content on during my free time. So if you're ever interested in Rust or you want to get started with WebAssembly, please go check out that channel. It's going to have some great content for you to get started with. Okay, so let's get into the reason we are all here, and that is the conversation on how to create great open source projects. How do you go about it? The way I like to think about open source is that I like to use the metaphor of a street. So open source is like a two-way street. On one side of the street, you have open source contributors. These are people who might be new to programming or who have been programming for a long time. So they are generally a group of developers that are passionate about software, and they want to give back to the software they've been using to make it better. So they have a lot of time on their hand, and even if they don't have time or probably have full-time jobs that they juggle around, they still are so interested in open source to the point that they're able to create the time needed to give back or contribute back to open source communities. Then on the other end of the street, you have open source maintainers. These are people who have been leading an open source project. So they have a lot of domain knowledge around the open source project. And sometimes they are really experienced programmers that are masters of programming, just like you see on the picture, we have Bruce Lee there. And in certain cases, they might be really eager to reject your PRs if you don't follow the rules, right? So that's why we're having this conversation so that we know how to work with maintainers, how to work with contributors to create stronger open source communities that support each other and grow. So that would be the entire conversation we'll be having. How can maintainers and open source contributors work together to build awesome open source communities? This talk is going to be a bit focused on the maintainer side because they lead open source projects and they determine the direction an open source project goes. But open source is not going to be complete without the contributors. So we'll talk both about maintainers as well as open source contributors and see how they can work better together. All right, so let's start by looking at what open source contributors can do to ensure that their contributions are welcome. The first thing they want to do, or the first thing they want to keep in mind, is that they want to be resourceful. They don't want to wait around to be babysitted by maintainers. And don't forget, many open source maintainers have a full-time job and they are engaging in open source work as a side project. Maybe something they're really passionate about and they decide to lead an open source project. So when you have questions and you ask them, you should not expect to get responses within the blink of an eye because these people are busy. They have jobs, they have families, or they have other things that might be taking their time. So you want to be respectful of their time. And that will mean that as an individual, you try to be resourceful as much as possible before reaching out to open source maintainers if you have issues. So if you are checking out a new open source project and you have questions around the project or how to go about contributing, you want to try to, on your own, check resources that could be helpful before asking questions. So first, check out the project's documentation. That's going to be the first thing you want to keep in mind. Try to go through the project's documentation. Even if you don't understand everything in the documentation, it's going to be a good starting point because by going through that documentation, you have some context around what the project is about. And then when you do get to speak with an open source maintainer, the maintainers of the project, you have some resources to refer to. So you would not be having a conversation from scratch since you already have some concept concerning the project. You also want to heavily rely on Google. I know sometimes we forget this, but Google is your friend. So if there is a problem you're facing, say for instance, you are done setting up the project and you're running into some errors, try to Google it. There are high chances that that specific issue you're having has been experienced by many other developers. So why not Google it? There could be a thread on Stack Overflow that discusses what that issue is, or someone may have created a GitHub issue around it and someone else has contributed a solution to the discussion on that issue. Or it could be that there's a blog post on it that someone else has written up. So why not just Google that problem you're having instead of always going back to ask the open source maintainer? Try to Google it for yourself. And for many open source projects, these projects have community forums. This could be on Discord, could be on Discourse. They could be using the GitHub community feature. So try to take advantage of these community forums to have such conversations with other open source contributors, or to also just search, right? Because someone else probably had that issue you're experiencing. So you could also use this as a data bank to search through issues or problems you might be facing and solve it for yourself without having to interact with another human. And if you do go through the process of trying to find this information for yourself and you don't get to find it, then it's okay to ask for help. You know you've done all you can, as much as it depended on you. Now you can actually meet with someone else, another contributor, or it could be the open source maintainer. It's okay for you to ask questions. And then the entire process of trying to go check out this information for yourself is going to be beneficial in two ways. First, when you do get to speak to a human, that is if you ever need to, you have a lot of context around what you have gone to done, your homework you've gone to done. It's going to provide you a lot of context around what the problem is and possible solutions that you may have tried. And then it makes the conversation a lot much richer because you wouldn't be having a conversation from scratch. And if you do go to check all of this out and you still don't find the solution to your problem, then it could be that there is an information gap somewhere and the open source maintainers need to fix it. Maybe they need to create more documentation around it. So that's also something good that can come out of you trying to be as resourceful as possible. So I highly encourage you to take out the time to do your own research. So read the docs. Don't end up like this guy here who is doing the wrong thing. Many open source projects have a contributing.md file, which is going to outline the project's code of conduct, how you expect it to make contributions, how you expect it to create pull requests. So read all of this information so that you don't end up doing the wrong things while trying to contribute. And if you do this, you're going to make life easy for yourself. And it's going to also make it more likely that your open source contribution is going to be accepted. So there are so many other things you can do, and we'll be talking about the next one now. It involves writing tests. I know no one likes to write tests, myself included, but writing tests is really important, especially for open source projects. The reason is the way open source works is you have a lot of contributions coming from people all over the world, and the maintainers of such a project needs a way to maintain the quality of code in the project. And how do you ensure that? Writing tests is one of it. So if tests are not written, the project is going to definitely have bugs introduced, and that could lead to issues later on. So you want to write tests when you contribute. You don't want to be the person who adds in a new piece of code and then the entire project crashes. You don't want to be that person. And don't forget that contributors come and go, but whatever contribution you make to an open source project is most likely going to be there forever. So why not ensure that your contributions are future proof and are bug proof by writing tests, right? And something to also keep in mind is that you should not be surprised, like given all of this information we've talked about when it comes to writing tests, you should not be surprised if your contribution is not accepted when you don't write tests. So it's an encouragement for you to go back, take the time, write good piece of code in your contribution, and then take out the extra time to write tests so that you ensure that your program or your contribution is doing exactly what it is required to do. So that's also really important for you to keep in mind. Okay, moving on to the next thing you should keep in mind when contributing to open source is that you want to document your code. Yes, it's really important to document your code. In fact, it's just as important as writing tests. So we've all been in this situation where we are using an open source project, perhaps a library. We're trying to build something and we're making use of a library someone else created. And then we get stuck somewhere and we need to go check out documentation on that particular issue we're facing. And we search and we don't find anything, right? We feel frustrated because in our minds, we're like, why is this developer not thorough enough to create good documentation around his project? But the irony of it is that we go back to write software that is not documented. We don't write comments, we don't create external documentation for it, and that's just the irony of the situation. So we want to form that habit of creating documentation for our code or our software, and it can start with something as little as writing comments, right? If you write comments in your code, you don't need to explain it to yourself or someone else because the entire context of the program is right there. You have a description, and then you see the actual implementation of what that piece of software is supposed to do. And the advantage of writing comments is that you don't need to explain it, right? So you don't need to explain it to yourself. So let's say you come back to work on that piece of software 6 months from now. You can actually jump right back in because you have all of the comments guiding you through. And then when you do go to create that PR to contribute to an open source project, A maintainer seeing your comments knows exactly what this contribution does, and then is also able to see the implementation to be able to conclude that, okay, this program is supposed to do this from the comments, and it's actually doing exactly what it is supposed to do. And it also helps new maintainers or new contributors rather, who are coming to check out the project, because they would not have to spend as much time trying to gain contextual knowledge of the project. They can easily jump in, and whatever file they open, there's going to be a comment there guiding them through what that file does. So please go on to write comments, document your code by writing comments, and also contributing to the external documentation if the project you're working on also has that as well. So there are a couple other things to keep in mind if you are an open source contributor, and let's just go over them in addition to what we already discussed. Like I mentioned earlier, most open source projects, they have a contributors.md file. So please go check that out. Go read that. It is going to help you a lot, because it is also going to outline the contribution style guide or guidelines for the project. So things like commit messages, how your commit messages are expected to be formatted is also going to be included in that file. So when you do go to create a commit, please ensure you are referring to that guide so that you have well-written commit messages and it doesn't cause confusion for anyone who might be looking at it later on. Then you also want to write good PR messages. Most mature open source projects have a template for pull requests. So ensure you make use of that, right? So that whatever pull request you'll be creating is going to be in line with what the maintainers of that project expect. So use the pull request template, fill in the description. If you have checkboxes in that template, check it off so that the maintainer knows upfront what this project or what this contribution is about, what checks you have done, and any other contextual information that will help in reviewing that PR should also be included in the PR message. Then for writing code, you want your code to be as clean and as simple as possible. It's not going to be the time for you to go copy and paste some random or exotic code you copy from Stack Overflow. So try to understand what you're writing. And even though if it's something you understand, also have in mind the next person who might be coming to work on this project. You want to keep them in mind so that whatever software you do write is something that is going to be understandable by everyone, not just you. So this is going to be the time for you to write simple and readable code, especially when it's a large open source project and you have various people who are interested in contributing. Then if you ever have questions, please ask them, ask the maintainers, but keep in mind what we said earlier about trying to be resourceful. So you want to go try to hunt down this information for yourself before reaching out to someone or a maintainer, but you're also encouraged to ask questions. And in fact, you can ask other contributors if that would get your questions answered quicker. Lastly, be patient when you do ask these questions. People are busy, so have a reasonable expectation of when people would be able to respond to the questions you raise. And as you keep on contributing to open source, you're going to get better. So keep doing it. If you're contributing to just one project right now, try to see if you can contribute to other projects within the same space. And as you do so, as you read other people's code, as you contribute more, you gain more experience and you become a better open source contributor. And you also make working with maintainers easier, right? So let's switch gears and let's talk about what open source maintainers are expected to keep in mind when it comes to building strong open source communities. So if you're a maintainer, you are a leader, and the first thing you want to do is recognize that you are the steward of a project and that it's also your responsibility to pass that knowledge on to the new maintainers who are coming up or contributors who are trying to add value to your project. So what you want to do as a maintainer is that you want to teach. You want to teach people. You want to ensure that your community is a safe space where people are welcome to learn and add value. And you do that by answering questions. When people have questions, you come on, you try to help them as much as possible, and you don't shun people for asking dumb questions. In fact, if you see a lot of people asking questions you tag as being dumb, that is actually feedback to tell you that something is not right somewhere. It could be that there are certain complexities in the project that could be simplified. So you might need to go back and redesign certain components in your project. Or it could be that you are lacking in educational resources around your project. So maybe you need more documentation or you need more comments. That's also a pointer to tell you what to do. So encourage people to ask questions, and when you do, trying to help them. It's your responsibility to teach and help your maintainers level up. And added to that, you notice that for most contributors, I mean, as a maintainer, you notice that most contributors actually start their journeys by creating an issue in your open source project. So they've probably gone to use your project, they like it, and they are stuck somewhere, and there's an issue that is related to your project, and then they create an issue on GitHub. You don't want it to end there. It's also your job as a maintainer to encourage these people to create contributions. And you do that by saying, in essence, I believe in you. You make it easy for them to create these contributions, because most times people who get to use your open source software also have the skills needed to fix some of the issues that they run in while using your project. So why not encourage them to make such contributions back to the project, so that they not only fix the issue they are facing, but also make the project better for everyone who might be interested in checking it out. So that's something you want to keep in mind as a maintainer of an open source project. Now, for people who are already contributing, you want to recognize them. You want to recognize top contributors, and you want to reward them. It's really easy to figure out who these people are. So on GitHub, you have your contributors graph, and that helps you figure out who are your top contributors from the community, so that you can identify and reward them. If you're using other platforms, maybe Discord or Discuss, they have a way to gather analytics on who engages the most with your community. Who is that contributor who answers a lot of questions that come up in your community, or who is that person who creates a lot of PR contributions. So you want to reward these people. You want to send them swags. If you have office hours for your open source project, you want to invite them on there. If you have a hero program, you also want to reward them in such a way. And you notice many big open source companies and projects do this. So for instance, GitHub has the GitHub Stars program. Microsoft has the Microsoft MVP program, and I think Google has the GD, Google Developer Experts program. So you want to have something similar, and the goal is to give recognition to your top contributors, so that they feel seen, they feel appreciated, and it's just going to incentivize them to actually contribute more. Now, the best part about giving recognition to top performers in your open source community is that you're not only recognizing the top performers, but you're actually also helping others who may not be performing as well to level up on their contribution. Like, you're giving them a status to attain to, or to reach. And the way I like thinking about it is using the metaphor of music. So if you're not playing any music, nobody dances. But the moment you start playing music, people are more likely to dance. And the way it relates to open source is that when you start rewarding top contributors, you notice that a lot of people will become more engaged and more willing to contribute to your open source project. But that should not be the reason they contribute, right? You don't want it to be a game they are playing. They should contribute because they're actually interested in moving the project forward. But rewarding contributors is going to be one way to tell them, thank you, I appreciate the work you've done, and be happy about it. And this could also be a way for you to recruit new maintainers into your project. So like, it's a win-win for everyone. It's a win-win for people who are contributing, and it's also a win for you who is a maintainer, because you get to pick out the best people from the community to become maintainers as well. All right, so moving on to the next thing to keep in mind. You also want to automate your development environment as much as possible. You don't want to be in a situation where a maintainer comes up to you, or rather a contributor comes up to you, you being a maintainer, and says that this fix I just created a PR for works on my computer. And you're like, I have checked it, but it doesn't work on my computer. It's not like we can ship your computer, right? So you want to try as much as possible to automate your development environment so that you don't run into a lot of issues or burdens that come with being a maintainer. So all of your tests should be automated. If you use a code formatter, it should be also part of the automation workflow. You should create a configuration file for it that is checked before any commit is made. If you use a linter, that should also be automated. And everything that requires checks should be run before a commit is made. There are a lot of pre-commit software that can help you ensure all of your tests, all of your linting, all of your formatting is executed before a contributor makes a commit. So you want to take advantage of these tools and softwares. And errors that come as a result of automation, say for tests, for instance, should be simple and clear enough so that you don't discourage people from contributing to your project. You want these error messages to be descriptive so that you tell people this is where the error is coming from and this is possibly how you can solve it, so that you're more likely to go back, make such adjustments, and then move on with your contribution. So you want to make it easy for yourself as well as the contributors who are coming to contribute to the open source project. And when you go ahead to ensure that everything is automated, you can actually sleep well at night, like this baby we have in the picture, right? So this is going to be the dream, automating everything and not having to do any work as a maintainer. But someday we're going to get there. But as much as possible, whatever it is you can automate right now, you actually should go on to do that. Okay, so one other thing to keep in mind as you lead your open source project as a maintainer is that you need to write good documentation. We already talked about documentation in the contributors piece, but as a maintainer, you need to ensure that good documentation is available for your project. And a good place to start is encouraging contributors to create comments for whatever code they are contributing to your project. So contribute a piece of code, encourage them to create comments, because it's going to help you review their code, and it's also going to help the next contributor who might be coming to take a look at that region of code. So encourage people to document their code. Then documentation also lives outside of the code, right? Many open source projects have documentation websites that has a lot more content, a lot more context and information to help people use your project. So that's also something you want to invest in. And for external documentations, they can be very tricky to organize and structure in such a way that everyone finds the information they need. So something I have found helpful that I'd like to share is a framework called the Diataxis. It's a documentation framework that helps you figure out the best way to structure content on your documentation so that it is accessible to everyone. And the gist of it, I highly encourage you to check it out. That's the website. It's diataxis.fr. But the gist of it is that your documentation should be broken down into 4 pieces and not just one. The first is going to be reference documentation, which is going to be geared towards more experienced users of your project who need precise descriptions about components. So think of something like an open API spec or the help tool of a command line application. These tools contain precise information that may be needed at each point while using your project. So you want to create reference documentation that people can easily glance through and figure out what they need to move on. Then you also want to create tutorials. This is going to be helpful to people who are new to your project, who want to get a feel of what this project can do. So you create end-to-end tutorials to help new users of your project get up to speed. Then another piece of documentation also involves concepts. Concepts cover the why of the project. So they contain a lot of high-level information, and they talk about the why certain things are the way they are in an open source project. And lastly, you also want to create how-to guides. That's the fourth component to creating good open source documentation. So how-to guides, they are more goal-oriented, they are focused, they help people get a particular thing done. And if you go check any major open source projects having a documentation, you notice that they have these four components in their documentation to help people find the information that they need when they need it. So that's something to keep in mind. You want to create great documentation as an open source maintainer. Okay, so what have been discussed? A couple of things. We've looked at what both open source maintainers and open source contributors can do to create great open source projects. And we started by talking about open source contributors. So if you're watching this and you're an open source contributor, you want to keep these things in mind. First is you want to be resourceful. Try to, as much as it depends on you, find information you need to move on with an open source project. It's great to ask questions, but try to be resourceful. Don't wait around for people, or try to bounce off questions or ideas you have with your peers instead of maintainers, if that's possible, because this is going to help you learn faster. And if there are gaps in knowledge in the process of trying to gather all of this information together, then you can either be in a position to contribute that knowledge back when you do get the answers to the issues you might be having, or present this to the maintainers so that they see it as something that should be worked on so that the next person does not have that same issue. So try to be resourceful. Then you also want to take out the time to read a product or a project documentation before you actually start contributing. Take a look at the contributors.md file, try to figure out what the code of conduct is, the guidelines around contributions for the project, what it is like, because the reality is that the culture around projects differ from project to project. So you want to figure out what it is for the particular project you are trying to contribute to. And this is also going to contain information related to setting up that project, how to set it up locally, how to run tests and all of that stuff. And when it comes to writing code, you want to keep your code simple, you want to keep it readable, you want to write tests to ensure that you're not introducing bugs unintentionally to the project you're contributing to. And after you're done writing code and tests, you should also go back to write documentation for the contribution you've made. This could be in-code documentation using comments. You could also contribute documentation to the external documentation site if the project you're working on has that. So ensure you write good documentation, because this is going to be valuable to you when you do come back to take a look at that region of code that you have worked on. And it's also going to be valuable to the next person who comes, because there's a lot of context and they don't have to worry about understanding what is going on. So form the habit of writing good documentation. It's just as important as writing tests. Then lastly, you want to try as much as possible to follow guidelines for contributors. Like I mentioned, open source projects have guidelines on making contributions, on creating commit messages, on creating pull request messages, on how the code is formatted or what linter to use. So all of that stuff is going to be documented somewhere in the project. Go hunt for that information and try as much as possible to follow the guidelines. And when you do all of this, you will be increasing your chances of having your contributions accepted, and perhaps even moving up to the rank of becoming a maintainer in the near future. So this is something you want to keep in mind as an open source contributor. All right, now for folks who are maintainers, there are a couple of other things they also want to keep in mind to ensure that their open source projects grow and is the kind of place that people want to contribute to. So open source maintainers should remember that they are teachers. They should transfer all of the domain knowledge they have about their project to their community by creating relevant documentation around it, by answering questions that contributors might have, by being there and helping people contribute. So teach your community. It's really important that you help people become successful using your project. Then you also want to identify those who are top contributors of your community, and you want to reward them for their contributions. That is going to help them contribute more, and it's also going to incentivize others who are not doing as much to pick up the slack and level up on their contribution and engagement with your open source project. So find out a way to reward those who are top contributors, and it's just going to make the project more enjoyable to work with. Then when it comes to writing software, you want to ensure that as much as possible, everything is automated, because um, contributors, rather maintainers, bear the burden of doing code reviews. So you want to ensure that everything that should be automated is automated until the point that you, a human being, comes in. So that involves automating tests, automating linting, automating formatting, anything else that needs to get automated should be automated. And something that is also going to be helpful when it comes to automation is it's encouraged rather to set up a CI server that runs all of your tests and automations when a PR is created, so that if a test is failing, you don't have to spend time trying to figure it out on your own by going through that project. If you have a pull request to the failing test, you know you can safely ignore that pull request until the contributor comes back to fix that failing test, and then you know, okay, this thing is ready, it's good to go. I can take a look at the code and actually review it. So it's going to help you save time, and it's going to help you sleep well at night when you have a lot of your work automated as much as you can. Then we also talked about documenting your project. You want to ensure you create good documentation. You want to encourage the culture of writing comments in code, so that people document the context needed for their code right there in the file. And for external documentations, we talked about a framework that can help you create good documentation for your project. So I highly encourage you, go check out that framework and see how you can make adjustments on your documentation if you need to. And lastly, you want to be welcoming to new contributors who might be checking out your project. They may ask dumb questions or silly questions. If they do, it's fine. You don't have to be angry about it, but it's also going to be a great point of insight to help you figure out what parts of your project you need to simplify, what parts of your project you need to create more documentation around, and how to make this documentation more visible to people who are just starting to use your project. So welcome new contributors and help them as they level up in their contribution to your project. Okay, so we've seen how both open source contributors and maintainers can work together to create good open source communities. And I think I'll be leaving a link to the slide below in case you want to go check it out to see what has been discussed. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle is @megaconfident, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have relating to open source and the software engineering space in general. So let me know if you have any questions. And with that, I guess we are at the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Confidence. What an inspiring and great session indeed. I hope everyone has learned a lot. Please drop your questions. I can see them. If you have questions, to drop it. Mr. Confidence will love to answer them. And you can see his Twitter, and we love to follow him. He gets a lot of great content. And also, we like to meet him on professional platform on LinkedIn. His name is Confidence. That's his name on LinkedIn.
Yeah, so you can just use you can actually just search for the exact same handle, Mega Confidence. I think the handle thing is becoming universal. YouTube supports handles, Twitter supports handles, LinkedIn also handles. My handle is the same across LinkedIn, Twitter, GitHub, YouTube. Yeah, so you can also check for that.
Thank you very much for this great session. I really learned a lot. The summary of the session focus on contributor and maintenance. If you're a contributor, make sure you are very resourceful. in the docs of the projects you want to contribute to. Write text before you do your PR. Document your code very well for other contributors to be able to understand it. And follow the contribution, the project you want to contribute, follow their guidelines because every project must have a guideline. And for maintainer, you know, if you are maintainer, what you look for is people to continue contributing to the project. So you teach the community and you reward contributors, you certify them, automate development environment, document the project, and welcome new contributors. Wow, it's a lot to take in. Thank you very much, Mr. Confidence. Thank you very much, and everyone. Thank you for attending this session.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure having this conversation with you. Okay, it seems the link to the presentation has been shared. So if you want to go over it on your own, that's the presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to take your questions.